Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CCTV News. I'm your host, Tian Wei. On today's program, U.S.-China trade friction as the U.S. feels the pressure of mounting economic competition. Is trade protectionism fueling its various investigations against Chinese companies? And a racist Chinese advertisement has caused a public uproar, raising questions about ingrained societal attitudes and the need for industry regulations. Trade frictions between China and the U.S. has ramped up recently, with the iron and steel sector at center stage. On Tuesday, U.S. International Trade Commission announced it would investigate a complaint by a U.S. iron and steel company alleging that Chinese steelmakers stole trade secrets through computer hacking, which has been denied by the Chinese steelmakers. These enterprises from China are following the tensions very closely.
An allegation that could result in a ban on nearly all imports from China's largest steelmakers. The U.S. Steel Corporation of Pittsburgh said that Chinese steelmakers and distributors conspired to fix prices, stole trade secrets, and misrepresented the origin of their exports to the United States. An official of China Iron and Steel Association pushed back against the allegations.
There's no factual basis for the charge against the China Iron and Steel Association. The U.S. made that up. Our association has never fixed the prices. U.S. steel companies know little about Chinese steel enterprises. They made all these things up, and the facts are untenable.
For the Chinese iron and steel industry, rising U.S. trade protectionism could present a serious challenge. The U.S. Commerce Department announced it would levy import duties of 522% on Chinese cold-rolled flat steel. Chinese trade officials protested at a press conference last Thursday.
The U.S. used very unfair methods in its anti-dumping and anti-subsidy investigation. For example, they refused to grant state-owned companies differentiated tax rates and have arbitrarily set unusually high duties.
Reports indicate that the Chinese iron and steel sector are facing the highest number of anti-dumping and other trade defense cases. Some say that this is the result of difficulties faced by the U.S. iron and steel industry. Additionally, the EU has also raised concerns about anti-dumping against Chinese iron and steel companies, blaming China's overcapacity for their job losses since 2008. Industrial insiders believe Chinese steel companies will have more battles to fight.
And for more on U.S.-China trade friction, we are now joined in the Beijing studio by Mr. Liu Baocheng, Professor and Dean of the Center for International Business Ethics from the University of International Business and Economics here in China. And also in Washington, D.C., we're having Mr. Charles Freeman, who is the International Principal at Forbes Tate LLC. He is also former U.S. Assistant Trade Representative for China Affairs. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. First of all, Professor Liu, what do you make of this complaint from the U.S. steelmakers against their Chinese counterparts stealing the secrets and fixing the prices?
Well, we are all facing the one picture, that is the glut of the steel. And now when the world commodity price becomes so embarrassing to the industry makers, so everyone is trying to fight for a fair bowl of rice. And now, but the issue is, what is fair? Is pushing the government to set up high barriers against foreign imports a fair way of dealing that? So that is sort of excuse that created to protect its own inertia and the laziness to improve in technology and improve in efficiency.
If I could reinterpret what you just said, just to answer my question, if I can, is what you are saying seem to suggest all of those accusations against the Chinese steel makers are groundless from the U.S. side toward the Chinese side. Is that what you're saying?
Well, it is really ethically unfair because this also, by setting up protectionist measures, you're going to, in the end, harm the consumers.
Okay.
And also,
well, I still don't get a direct answer. So let me see if I could get a direct answer from Mr. Freeman. What do you make of this? Is this making excuses for not transforming its own industry? Or is this trade war likely to be seen for a long time?
Well, I think we should step back a second and remember that steel imports into the United States from China are less than about a half a percentage point of all imports from China. So this is a very small part of U.S.-China trade. The reality is that China has had a glut and overcapacity for many, many years in steel, and you just don't have that kind of overcapacity without affecting global market prices downward. Is it protectionism in the U.S.? Of course it is. Of course it's an effort to try to protect U.S. steel companies from competition with foreign exporters. In some cases fairly, in some cases just because the industry is so loud.
How much does it have to do with the very special political season that we're in, Mr. Freeman, inside the United States? Of course, you've got the economy just recovering. Some would suggest quite stably progress. While at the same time, we got the presidential election. China, of course, is an easy target more and more, it seems.
Well, China is always a target during political seasons for one reason or another. Partly because I think many of our candidates just don't simply understand the way trade works. So China sometimes gets unfairly called out by politicians for trade practices. In steel, I think you have a legitimate concern with the amount of overcapacity that even Beijing has said for years it was trying to control, and for whatever reason, politically or otherwise, has not been able to reduce capacity in the Chinese steel market.
Mr. Freeman has a very humble attitude about the situation. It seems quite a liberal attitude toward some of the candidates for president, it seems. But what about from the Chinese side?
He's telling the truth.
Professor Liu, from the Chinese side, what actually has been the process for the Chinese side to work out its transformation of the steel industry, which, as Mr. Freeman just honestly suggested, has also been a very challenging process for China politically as well.
Yeah, you mentioned the battle. So actually China is fighting a battle at both fronts. And internationally, we're fighting for fair competition. And domestically, we are also fighting a battle against the excessive capacity. And because many of the state-owned firms are really dominating the Chinese steel industry, so the possible reduction of workforce may really send a trail into the job market, and that's something the government is very much concerned. So, but having said that, China really recognizes that there is excessive capacity around the world, and China is also most outstanding in this. And plus, the quality of the Chinese steel, both for domestic consumption and for export, is not there to compare with the upper class quality of the peers. So therefore, we need to reduce number one, the zombie enterprises, and also we need to reduce the production of low quality steel.
But the question is, how efficiently can we do that? And how efficiently can other countries, other economies deal with that? The steel industry is quite a stubborn industry. It's been there for quite some time and has very loud and powerful voices politically. There is numbers coming from the UK, which also complain about China's imports of steel, suggesting that its pension system might be very much influenced by the deficit of those from the steel industry. So, Mr. Freeman, of course, that's a case from Europe, but what about from the United States? Half a percentage of the U.S. trade with China only when it comes to steel, overall speaking. Why is it having such a strong voice? Can that voice be, in a way, reasonably contained so that it's not going to spill out of proportion, and the overall bilateral trade will not be necessarily poisoned as a result of that?
Well, any time that you've got core industries like steel or agriculture that are facing trade challenges, they tend to be more politically loud, as we've said, than others, and this is certainly the case with steel. In the U.S., every time there has been a major focus on trade, steel, and the need to protect U.S. steel industry from foreign competition has always come up. It came up in the context of the Bush administration, the last Bush administration's efforts to pass trade law, and now we're coming at a time when Obama faces a very difficult political fight to pass the Trans-Pacific Partnership through the Congress. So doing something that suggests that the administration is going to get tough on core political issues of trade is certainly part of the calculation.
Very interesting over there, because we do have some numbers to support, it seems, even what you have just said, Mr. Freeman. According to the annual Global Trade Protection Report, the U.S. has overtaken India as the leading orchestrator of anti-dumping and other trade defense cases, with 33 anti-dumping cases in 2015 and a further 22 anti-subsidy investigations. Metal cases made up a record 46% of the 233 anti-dumping actions brought worldwide in 2015, almost all of which were in the steel industry. That is just a reality. Let's come back to you, Professor Liu. That's a reality. What can China do? The U.S. side was suggesting China's steel industry was violating the WTO rules. So can China figure out what exactly those rules are and whether Chinese ones are really violating them? Can Chinese also make use of the rest of the WTO rules to fight against the American complaints?
I think now a major uncertainty lies in the fact that China is not recognized the market economy so far. So hopefully by the end of the year, that's the 15 years of transition, so we smoothly get over that. But that's hopefully, but it's really unlikely.
It's tricky, isn't it? I mean, at the time when all sides signed on this WTO, China's access to WTO, this market economy status is a very interesting one. It was said by different sides that China should be a market economy by the end of this year.
That's right.
Of course, different sides have different interpretations. So that's once again another thorny issue. Can we resolve this thorny issue by looking at a solution which is also a thorny issue?
No, I'm not really very optimistic about the automatic approval of market status, at least from the U.S. side, but there is also a mixed feeling over whether EU is going to smoothly approve. So because there is no really fixed writing over whether there's going to be a review or not. But the situation leads to the fact that both EU and the United States will lose a very important weapon to retaliate the aggressive export of China. So therefore, I think they are reluctant to really give it up. But on the China side, yes, we do need to streamline the steel industry, given its proportion to the Chinese real estate development and infrastructure development, and also we need also to find more more diversified marketplace for our production, because we do enjoy price-wise the advantage.
Okay, Mr. Freeman, WTO rules, which part are we talking about? There are so many rules and so many possible agreements, different interpretations.
Well, I think there are questions of subsidies and others. I think the issue of market economy status is very interesting. Those of us that have a lot more gray in our hair than others remember when China joined the WTO that the question of market economy status may have actually been an automatic one. Many of us suspected that in the end of 2016 that China would automatically be granted market economy status under WTO rules. Certainly that's something that China can press in Geneva towards the end of the rule if it is not granted market economy status by fellow WTO members. But I do think that in this political age in particular, the question of market economy status is a political question, unless an economic or trade policy question. After all, the amount of anti-dumping duties that are applied to Chinese Chinese imports in the United States are a very, very infinitesimal amount of overall trade. They tend to be pretty politically significant, but not economically significant. So the question for the two governments in Washington and Beijing is whether they can overlook some of these politically incendiary, but not particularly economically significant or substantial trade policy tools.
But Mr. Freeman, do you think they will?
Will what? Will they grant the market economy status?
No, will they be able to, the two governments, as you just suggested, to overcome some of those?
It's a very good question, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the two sides are really engaged on a level where they have political understanding between the two capitals. Most of the U.S. side, most of U.S. trade policy is aimed at trying to convince the Chinese bureaucracy to change Chinese practices. But as we've seen, increasingly, a lot of the economic and trade decisions are not made at a government level, but at a party level in Beijing. And so it's difficult for the two sides to come to agreement when they're really talking past each other.
It is not only what and where and how the decisions are being made, but also what has been the role, evolving role of trade and economic ties between China and the United States in the overall bilateral relations. Professor Liu, you and Mr. Freeman know this better than I do. I mean, it used to be the case that trade and economic ties are the very, very strong foundation for a ever moving forward relation between China and the U.S. And it seems that something have changed since Chinese economy has already become the second largest in the world. What can we expect the role of trade ties for future China-U.S. relations? What do you think, Professor?
I think both countries still enjoy a high level of reciprocity, across the industry, where China is moving from the low-end manufacturing more into the midstream manufacturing. So there is still a high level of compatibility, and also the U.S. consumers and the downstream. The industry really rely on the cheap and the reliable supply from China to make this to make the economy and make their recovery more stable.
All right, and Mr. Freeman, role of the trade ties between the two countries, overall the most important bilateral ties, what exactly is it?
Well, I think I agree completely with Professor Liu that the relationship is fundamentally sound, and it doesn't need to be over politicized. Trade between the two countries and the economic relationship has really kept the overall U.S.-China relationship very positive for something like 25 years. As China has, as China's economy has developed and Chinese industry is increasingly not just compatible with U.S. industry, but as it becomes more competitive, I think you're going to see increasing stress in the relationship. But let's be honest, we have a very mature relationship, but it's not even as mature as that between the U.S. and Europe. And we have trade frictions between the U.S. and Europe, which make those between China and the United States look rather tame. So I think cooler heads should prevail in this. I'm not sure when you have some of the rhetoric coming out of the political campaigns in the United States, which is very anti-China and somewhat ignorant about the way trade works, candidly. I'm not sure that this side will be the one, that the U.S. side is the one that will be politically mature enough to manage the relationship by making sure the economic relationship works.
Well, it seems by doing comparison, one can become an optimist. Thank you so much, Charles Freeman from Washington, D.C., and also Liu Baocheng here in Beijing. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for being with us. All the best. Stay with us here on World Insight. We got our final segment coming right up. A racist Chinese advertisement has gone viral, sparking a discussion about why prejudice remains pervasive in China, as they say. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight on CCTV News. Recently, a Chinese laundry detergent commercial provoked a media storm and allegations of racism after it was posted on YouTube. The advert shows a black man being stuffed into a washing machine before transforming into a fair-skinned Asian man. Last weekend, the manufacturing of Qiaobi, the laundry detergent, issued a public apology for having caused the controversy. However, the apology itself was also criticized for being insensitive. This lack of cross-cultural awareness has underscored the need for Chinese companies to evolve in the global market.
A controversial advert. A Chinese laundry detergent commercial has sparked outrage online, domestically and overseas, with many social media users labeling it racist. In the past few days, the ad has been watched more than 8 million times on YouTube. The advertisement for Qiaobi laundry detergent depicts a black man who emerges as a pale Asian man after being forced into a washing machine with a detergent packet. Another Italian detergent advert showing a white man forced into a washing machine and transformed into a black man came to light afterwards for supposedly having inspired the Qiaobi advert. Though lots of Chinese netizens have condemned Qiaobi for racism, others have noted that there is less awareness of racial issues in China.
It doesn't mean that Chinese people are against the idea that everyone is equal and should be respected.
Last Saturday, the firm apologized, saying that they strongly oppose and condemn any racism and broadcast the advert with no intention of racial discrimination. But the company also called on the media and netizens to avoid overinterpreting the advert. This apology was also criticized for its tone deafness.
Many Chinese companies fail to understand the sensitivity of racism. It's a shame, but it's common in China.
Chinese companies often lack training on cultural sensitivity. Experts say that if they want to engage more in the international market, there is much to learn.
Much to learn, yes, indeed. For more on this, I'm joined here in the Beijing studio, first of all, by Victor Gao, CCTV current affairs commentator, and Lionel Donovan, social media correspondent. Meanwhile, joining us from Chicago, we're having Professor Da-Li Yang. He is a professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Chicago. Welcome to the three of you, gentlemen. So, what do you make of it, the advertisement, Lionel?
I believe that it's very disappointing. I think that it is, I think that the ad was basically playing on a stereotype that black people around the world have been fighting hundreds of years to combat against, you know. And it's disappointing coming from a place like China when China has tried to project itself as an ally for black countries and people around the world. And to see something like this, like I said, it's very disappointing.
Victor, what do you make of it? I mean, why would a company put on an advertisement now in the 21st century using racism in a way stupidly in the advertisement? It is very hard to imagine someone would do that today, particularly in China.
Indeed, I watched the replay of the commercial, and I personally am completely disgusted by the insensitivity.
Appalled also by
Yes.
someone who could do that.
Indeed, not only the insensitivity, but also the racism and the prejudice embodied in that commercial. I actually condemn this commercial, and I don't think the company which released this commercial has apologized enough. This could actually be tantamount to a hate crime. So I think the regulators and the investigators should really get into the bottom of this and also make sure that such heinous mistake will not be repeated in China. But allow me to emphasize one point: this does not represent the Chinese people or China as a country.
This is exactly
This
what
is
I
a very
want to.
isolated.
This is exactly what I want to ask. Not only in China, but also Chinese all over the world. You know, people with the Chinese origin. Professor Yang, probably you can help me as well. You are coming from the United States. You've been doing cross-cultural communications for a long time. When it comes to the Chinese understanding of you know, African Americans, for example, where Lionel is coming from, or other black people, what has been the traditional belief? How do Chinese traditional looking at the other races. Is this commercial a stupid, sporadic case, or is it a reflection of a national or a racial attitude that the Chinese all over the world have about the others?
Well, that's an extremely complicated question.
It is.
Historically, you go back into Chinese dynasties, for example, the Han Chinese were ruled by, for example, the Mongols, the Manchus, and of course, also even in the Tang Dynasty, the rulers were not Han Chinese. So China actually in the past had been pretty diverse as far as the local people are concerned. But of course, in recent decades in particular, it's been subjected to also discrimination from other countries as well. Of course, China has been the subject of imperialism and so on. But over time, however, I detect again, there are various cultural and racial stereotypes that have arisen. And this actually goes against also the effort by the Chinese government and also the leaders to reach out. For example, the Chinese leadership in the 1950s were very supportive of the civil rights movement in the United States. It also was very, very in the vanguard in supporting, in allying with African countries.
Right.
So in that sense, actually, the leadership has been saying the right things, has been doing the right things. But at the same time, Chinese society is very diverse. And people are not very shy about various stereotypes, whether it's about height, about handicapping, and all sorts of issues. And of course, skin tones happen to be one of those as well.
I see. Lianliao, what do you think? Is it an issue of awareness, or is it an issue of attitude? I mean, this is two different things. One is the awareness of what is politically correct and politically sensitive. The other thing is that you have or you do not have racial prejudice against the other people. These could be two different things, yet with reflected, seem to lead to same results sometimes. What do you think, which is exactly this?
Well, that's what I feel. There's a line of thought that people in China, or the idea of the Chinese people discriminating against others because of the color of their skin, isn't really racism, but it's classism. But that argument is mostly academic. The results of that way of thinking is usually the same. For example, if I'm a black person from Uganda and I'm going for a job in as teaching, and I get passed over because they're looking for someone with white skin, whether it's racism or classism, at the end of the day, I'm being discriminated against because of the color of my skin. So as you were saying, it's how you get to this point is secondary to the fact that we have gotten to this point, and the line of thinking should be, how do we move away from it, or how do we grow from it?
It's interesting because what you have just said can be very interesting to compare to what the United States, for example, has been going through. Earlier, Professor Yang from the U.S. talking about China was supporting the civil rights movement back in the 1960s inside the United States, and of course supporting the prejudice against racism in the country as well. It is not rare, Professor Yang, I mean now even in the United States, that some states are still having certain kinds of policies which can be identified as racially prejudicial toward the African Americans or Black Americans. But of course, those are the internal politics inside the U.S. But when you look at China's attitude, what can China learn from this evolvement of social movement? For example, inside the U.S., for example, the independence movement of the African countries back in the 60s and 80s. How much can China learn to raise the awareness, not only for the people, but also really for these businesses, which is getting ever more global, Professor?
Well, I think number one, I'm not very much into conspiracy theory generally, but for companies, and this is an individual company, we have to recognize, sometimes they deliberately engage in this kind of advertising that are very controversial, but also they know that controversy really gets the attention, and controversy in many ways sells. And that's actually, in many ways, the company is getting a lot of free advertising by actually stoking the fires of controversy. But that's also precisely, and what you're doing, for example, is doing the right thing in terms of engaging the public, engaging people from different backgrounds and so on to discuss the issue. I've also looked at the discussions on Weibo and so on. There are many Chinese who are very critical of the ad, and I think that's a very healthy sign of a society that's willing to recognize that there is an issue, this lack of sensitivity, that Chinese companies today do not live in an isolated world, that they are part of the world as already. In the past, there are a lot of things that happen in China. People think that, oh, we are just in China. People in other countries don't read Chinese, can't understand us, and therefore it's not an issue. But that's no longer the case. So in that sense, actually, and it's not just about the issue of the color tone, but also on many other issues, Chinese society have to discuss them, engage them, sometimes engage in lawsuits and other things in order to force changes.
Yes, indeed. As you said, Professor Yang, there has been an enormous amount of uproar, even in China. That's why we are putting this as one of the important topics for our show today, to talk about whether there's racism in China, and if there is to a certain amount, how shall we face them. In fact, there has been different stories being told in so many different medias, and some of the previous racially discriminative materials have also been used just to showcase to people what shouldn't be the case anymore today. Let's take a look at some of those excerpts of materials used decades ago to understand why the Chinese need to be very much aware of this issue. Take a look at this.
This Swedish commercial, which dates back to the 1920s, has a similar plot. A woman seems to dislike an African man, but after he is washed white, she is happy. A similar idea can be found in these pictures too. Every one of these has the same idea.
Of course, those are racially discriminative advertisements used decades ago. And now we're criticizing this very stupid advertisement coming from one Chinese detergent company. But you know, Victor, what Dali said just now is interesting because he was trying to suggest maybe this company was trying to play with racism to raise their profile among the public. Of course, whether it's positive or negative is another thing. It comes to the question as to what method a company should use to promote itself, particularly Chinese companies these days, when it's already getting the international spotlight.
Well, in this particular case, I don't think we should tolerate the situation whereby this company, which is responsible for this discriminatory commercial, should just get over this situation by so-called apologizing for this. I don't think that's the right way. I think the government agencies really need to launch an investigation and eventually hold the company responsible for whatever intentions or whatever reasons which gave rise to this very, very appalling and disturbing commercial.
But you have to think about this, Victor. I mean, this is not only the company itself, but also the advertising agencies working for the company.
They are working together.
And
in the
also,
same team.
and
Yes.
also whatever broadcasting platform this
Exactly.
advertisement was managed to put on,
Yeah.
has also to be responsible. Of course, it might not necessarily attract a lot of audience because for quite a few weeks, nobody even noticed until it went viral about racism, this piece of advertisement. So what do you make of the overall boundage of these different players in this case?
I think that's exactly why I'm calling for official investigation into this instance, because if we cannot get to the root cause and use this as a precedent so that people here in China, corporates or individuals, will learn a big lesson in terms of racial sensitivity and treating everyone of whatever color equally,
ethnicity.
for example, or then we may go in the wrong direction further and further. On the other hand, allow me to make one point. China is one of the few countries in the world which has never practiced institutionalized racism. On a person-to-person level, people may have different preferences, for example. But I don't think, throughout the Chinese history, there has been any government-initiated legislation or act, for example, or system or institutionalized system of discriminating against people based on color. This is very different from countries like India, where the caste system remains in practice even today, and the caste system is more or less based on the color of the skin, or with a country like the United States, which has practiced the slavery for centuries, and even today there are legacies of the racial discrimination and slavery, for example. And I think on the Chinese side, I normally would treat people in Africa as my brothers and sisters. And in that sense, I'm particularly appalled by this advertisement. I think the Chinese government and most people here in China, like me included, have been advocating for equality of all the people, regardless of the color of the skin. And this is why this commercial is really very, very disturbing.
It is disturbing, and it is disgustingly surprised, I would say, by many here in China. Liang, after this uproar of debate in China, what do you make of your friends' debates about this piece of advertisement? And of course, you work for CCTV here in Beijing as an editor. So when you are doing your work, or when you're interacting with other foreign editors, what have been the focal point of discussion? And what do you make of this situation in China that you can share with our audience worldwide?
Well, like the gentleman next to me was saying, we were also very appalled by this. And it comes off as extra disappointing because like the ads that you showed earlier, these same countries had these kinds of ads for Chinese people and for Asians. These kinds of illustrations existed where they made caricatures of Asians by having with very small eyes, very giant teeth, and very, very yellow skin. So the Chinese were subjected to the same kind of stereotypes that were put on by black people and that were on display in this ad, and it speaks to an unfortunate way of thinking that has come out by many people here in the country, because the problem that usually arises is that when China is a very ethnocentric country, and they have always prized fair skin. In the upper class, fair skin was always something to be sought after. And so usually the negative attributes were always associated with dark skin, such as poverty, lack of education, promiscuity, things like that. So when you see somebody with dark skin, if you were raised in that culture, you'll also always associate that with them. And so when you're confronted with things like this, it reminds you that with all of the progress that China has made in regards to reaching out to African nations and just black nations as a whole, as far as investment, as far as supporting them in liberation movements back in the 50s and 60s, there's still more work to be done.
All right, Professor Yang, Dali, let me ask you this. What Leonel just said, there seems to be two things. One is how the Chinese look at their own skins, lighter tone or the darker tone, and also the traditional belief of what is beauty. Does that have anything to do with China's attitude toward, or the Chinese attitude toward other people of color? And also, has attitudes changed, the social attitudes changed, even about beauty here now among the Chinese population? Will that also have an impact on the evolving attitude that the Chinese could have toward other races?
Well, certainly those social issues are very important, and they are not just limited to the U.S. In fact, in the African American community in the United States, this is actually also an issue that's being debated. And the fact that there are many people who prefer fairer skin, and the beauty industry has also played to that theme in many ways, actually advertising for various cosmetics and so on. But at the same time, the difference between what's known as colorism and then the issue of races actually sort of gets blurred at one point. So in that sense, actually, this issue of discrimination or stereotyping of different people actually is not a close and is actually a much more prevalent issue today. In fact, it's not isolated, and it pertains to quite a few societies in many ways, including in the United States. And I think it's an issue that will continue to attract a lot of attention and requires efforts by people to recognize that beauty comes in many different colors and shades, so to speak.
Yes, indeed. Lionel, even the Republican presidential candidate, Donald Trump, has been very provocative, if I could use the least term, to talk about races, particularly toward the immigrants coming from different parts of the world when it comes to the color of skin and the role they play inside the American society. So the question is, are we seeing a world pretty much divided by what they presume as the right idea toward race, that they become ever more vocal, even though we hope that the world could be respecting to all the races? But are we seeing a divide now, that those are becoming ever more provocative toward racism, and also those that are always guarding toward equality, not necessarily having the bigger voice? This is quite a political question, I have to say, inside the United States, and probably can spill over toward other countries as well.
Yes, it can. Martin Luther King Jr. had a quote. He said that an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. As our world becomes more interconnected, and as we become a more of a globalized society, we can't afford to ignore issues of race in whatever country that, they're seen in.
It's an interesting discussion, I have to say, gentlemen. Thank you so much for being with us. I'm sure that discussion will continue, not only on this specific case studies, but also many other things to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Lionel Donovan.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Victor Gao.
Thank you.
And Dali Yang. Really appreciate, gentlemen, for being with us. And that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of the program, visit our website. Just type in World Insight CCTV News into your search engine. You will be able to find us, where you can also check out our YouTube channel. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone at the World Insight team, thanks for watching, and tune in again tomorrow for more insights from across China and around the world. Good night.